laws of the Shema. And we are continuing with more of the rules about when it's appropriate to recite the Shema. We just finished talking about reciting the Shema when you're involved in a funeral. And now we're going to talk about what happens when you're trying to recite the Shema when you're at home. So in many of these cases, people had smaller homes and often would find their whole family in bed with them or in the same room with them, which is not an uncommon even in modern times, but it seemed to be just as common back then as well. So the question was, when was it appropriate to recite the Shema? Would one have to necessarily get completely out of bed in order to recite the Shema? So this is important to note because we want to make sure that we have established appropriate places to recite the Shema, and we'll be going over those laws in the coming Siman, in the coming chapters. So we'll probably get through this relatively quickly today. Maybe we'll even get into 74 today, but we are in Siman 73. So in this case, we're talking about people who are sleeping together in the same bed. So it says two people that were sleeping under the same sheet, under the same sheet, and the two of them are touching each other. Okay, so I mean, like their skin is touching each other. One may not recite the Shema until the bed sheet separates them at the very least from the waist down under. So one is not allowed to recite the Shema when they are touching another person, unless they are completely covered or if they are covering themselves. So the reason why the Mishna explains why are they touching each other, because you need to make sure that you're actually dressed and not necessarily everybody's dressed under the bed sheet. So if you are touching somebody else, it's distracting. And you also have to look away from each other. But if they are sleeping face to face, no matter how dressed they are, it will be prohibited because you need to focus on the Shema and not the person sleeping next to you. Okay? And the reason why is because you'll become distracted reciting the Shema. I mean, you talked about this earlier about being distracted during the Shema. It's not appropriate. Okay? So, however, if you cover yourself completely in the tallis and you cover yourself all the way up to your face, it's not a problem. Okay, and so especially if you're going from the waist down, that's also at the very least, and you're not facing each other, that's appropriate. Okay, however, Yeshua explains you have to have your head outside of the other part of. You can't just put your head completely under the sheet because you need to be somewhat dressed in order for it to be appropriate. So if your head is also under the sheet, that kind of defeats the purpose of being dressed. It's like being undressed in another place. The idea of being dressed is that you have clothing going on you, and then the rest of you is in like a separate covered place. So you can't just stick your whole body under the sheet to recite the Shema. Okay, so if someone did this wrong, and you want to know if you fulfilled your obligation, some people say yes, some people say no. So the proper thing to do is to repeat and get yourself properly dressed. Okay. Now, if a person was resting in bed with his wife, so he would have to turn his face away. Okay, and turn it to the other side. And however, you're not required to go ahead and block yourself under the sheet from your partner, because you're considered when you're married, you're considered one person. However, there are those who are strict, and therefore we should follow the strict opinion. Okay, and so therefore you're not as distracted when lying in bed with your spouse, because that's a person you're normally with, so you're considered like one body. Okay, but you should still turn your face away so you're not distracted by looking at somebody's face. Okay, and you also need to make sure that you are at the very least covered from along the waist, so that's also important. So, and the person who is stringent, the stringent opinion is you still need to take the covers and drape them around your body like in the first case. Okay, and so therefore by Kriya Shema, you should be very careful. And normally this is an issue, the Mishna explains, is when you're reciting the bedtime prayer, the bracha known as Hamapil. So that's when you would be reciting the Shema and reciting that blessing, and that's why these laws are so important. However, if you've properly covered yourself, then even if you're facing the other person, it would be acceptable. Now, let's say your kids jump in bed, okay, and they're in bed, and they're little kids, okay. So you don't have to worry about wrapping yourself in the talus as much, but you have to look away from them and their behavior. And if they're older kids, then you have to have the same rule apply, okay? Because they don't have the same leniency as with one sleeping with their spouse, but they do have the leniency of that they are your children. Okay, so the question is, how distracting are they? So since they are kind of like your own person, and you're not going to be so distracted by that, you still need to turn away and focus on saying your blessing. However, there are people who are even more lenient in the Shulchan Aruch, and they say that you don't have to do any of these requirements. However, most people say that at the very least, even though you're not having to turn away from facing them, you shouldn't be in full contact with them, so you're not distracted by that. And when we said that you need to make sure that you are back to back with them while reciting the Shema, so you need to make sure that your kids don't turn around and start annoying you or harassing you while you're trying to recite the Shema. And especially that they're not holding on to you, so that way you're not distracted by that. And that's with little kids. So with older children, you have to be more strict. And so too, if for whatever reason another child is found their way in bed, let's say a niece or a nephew or whatever it is, that you don't have this leniency extended to them. So the main thing is that a person should try to be strict about this, and constantly keep themselves covered. Okay, so we said there's older kids and younger kids. In Halacha 4 over here, the question is, so what are considered little kids? That's considered an infant until they are 12 years old. Okay, and that's for a young boy, and for a young girl, it's from infancy until 11 years old. Okay, and even if they have started to show some signs of puberty, it's still permitted to be lenient in these cases. However, when they're 13 for a boy and 12 for a girl, okay, and they start to show signs of puberty, they have to treat them like an adult. And as we said before, they're not the same rule as your spouse, and so therefore you need to put the cover in between yourselves. So when we say they have to turn this age, the Mishnah explains it's the day after that birth. They have to have one other full day after that. So the other thing to be aware of over here. So we say that reaching puberty should be the defining sign. However, since this is a case that's a rabbinic stringency, they were a little more lenient to say that they had to do that. Now, obviously, another thing not mentioned here so explicitly is that this is only talking about a case people aren't necessarily wearing full pajamas. If you're wearing full pajamas in these cases, then you can simply turn away from each other. You don't have to worry about using the sheet. These cases here specifically, people who weren't wearing full pajamas. And full pajamas, we mean that you have on pants or shorts and then a shirt on top. And the shirt is mostly closed. So the idea is that you're not going to be distracted by how people look or when they're making contact with you. So in those ways, you can avoid some of the issues of being distracted during the Shema. All right, let's actually continue into 74 over here, because 74 is a little bit more interesting. This is the reflecting on the prohibition to not say blessings or the Shema when one is uncovered, when one is naked. Okay, so the whole problem is that people need to be somewhat presentable when reciting the Shema, but not 100% presentable. They need to be, at the very least, as if they would present themselves to another person, not necessarily stand before the king. We're going to learn later on that there's a greater requirement when reciting Shema Esrei. You have to be even more presentable. But by Shema, since it's sort of an ikr thing and it's meant to be part of your daily routine, the Shema will creep up on you in these various states of dress and undress. So therefore, the rabbis felt it was important to talk about when you would be permitted to say it and when not. Okay, so we're going to address this now. So talking about our case, if one was sleeping with no clothing on except for his bed sheet, then he needs to take this bed sheet close to his heart. Again, even if they're by themselves, not being distracted by others in the bed with them. They have to wrap it around their chest below the heart. Okay, and then he can recite the Shema. Why? Because the Talmud says that one should avoid libo roa esa erva, where one's own heart sees their own private parts. That's not permitted. Okay, one has to separate. The heart is sort of the seat of intelligence, and they need to be somewhat presentable when they're talking about their feeling of accepting the yoke of heaven. It's inappropriate to be in states of undress. Okay. And the Ramah adds, it's also the same case if your heart sees someone else in a state of undress. So you have to make sure that not only you are dressed, but you are around other people who are also not dressed. So those are both requirements. That's the first halacha over here. So the reason why the Gemara is quoted here directly. The point was that he was talking about a case that the Talmud actually brought up. So the Mishna says, now what if you have your pajamas on? Okay, well, there's a difference. If you're sleeping in a sort of a nightgown, then it's not any different than sleeping just under your sheet. So even though it's a gown, the problem is that you need to be presentable, which means you have to have something separate between the heart and the lower body. And so therefore, this is also talking about a case where one is also not wearing any types of trunks of some kind. Because you're not allowed to even speak Divrei Torah if you're not dressed appropriately. You're not allowed to say any blessings until you are covering your heart and separating the sort of the intellectual part from yourself from the more physical part of yourself. And so therefore, if you were only wearing the sheet or only wearing a gown and you didn't have anything on just below the waist with some type of band, then you need to actually physically separate your heart from that lower part of yourself. Okay, and what you need to do is actually to squeeze the sheet against your chest to separate it between yourself and your lower body. And without that, you wouldn't be allowed to recite the Shema. And we mentioned just a smidge earlier that some people say even if you did that, you should still recite the Shema again, and you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So there's also another thing to do, which is to take another sheet and to wrap it underneath your chest, below your ribs, and that would be fine. So that way there should be some type of distribution between your upper body and your lower body. And that would be fine even if you are having your upper body uncovered. That would be acceptable. The idea is that you should have a separation between your upper body and your lower body. And why is this? The Mishnah explains why is this such an issue? Because the Torah seems to connect sight with distraction for when you see lower parts of people's bodies. Okay, men, women, whoever it is. Because the Torah says, "Lo yirevacha ervas davar." One should not see in themselves an unspeakable thing or an unmentionable thing. And even there, it's talking about how you shouldn't be around the bathroom materials and so on. It also means that you shouldn't be around people who are unpresentable, and therefore you should make sure that you're presentable. And that's why the rabbis were strict about this. So that's why it's important that even though if your heart is covered like with a long robe or a long shirt, you still have to separate between the two parts, the upper and the lower. Okay, and then therefore, even if you were covered and have a long gown, but you don't have something separating between your waist and your upper body, you can't recite Torah, nothing, no matter how much you are covered up. And also, you would need to have something on your head as well. So therefore, one really exception is that let's say since it needs to be in different places, technically speaking, if you were standing in your house and you had no clothes on and you stuck your head out the window, so that you couldn't see back into the house, whatever you had over there. So even though you can't see it, it still isn't permitted because you still have the heart itself still seeing that lower part of your body being uncovered. Okay, so that would be appropriate. However, if you were sleeping, let's say, in a tent of some kind, and you stuck your upper body out of the tent, and it's not 10 tefachim high, it's not considered its own little tent. It's like a big sheet. That would be like having a sheet covering you if it's less than 10 tefachim high, so less than about 35, 40 inches. And that would actually work. So even if you had no clothes on the lower body, but you sort of scrunch out of the tent, and you put it below your ribs and say the Shema, that would actually suffice. Okay. And so he goes back to discuss further over here that if you went ahead and recited Shema anyway and didn't do it correctly, that you would have to recite the Shema again, you have to repeat your blessings again, and you'd have to repeat Shemona Esrei again. Okay, and that's what they're being very, very strict in these cases. But some people are lenient when it comes to other blessings, like if you had a snack in bed and you said a bracha on that, maybe you could be lenient on that. And so he quotes famously the Chayei Adam, who says that you could do that. Okay, and he's even lenient the Chayei Adam even when it comes to Shemona Esrei. And so therefore you shouldn't repeat blessings needlessly. Okay, so and we say also we finish off over here that your friend also has to be dressed appropriately. So if you're sleeping next to each other and they're not appropriately dressed, or they're in the same room as you, then you have to make sure they cover up, and then you turn your face away from them. Okay, or you could cover up your head and your eyes. That way you can't see them. Okay. So repeating the blessing in this case due to error is not making another blessing in vain. So that's a good question. So you would have to do this intentionally. Yeah, if you did it in error, like you didn't notice that they were there like that, as long as you're dressed appropriately, you'd be okay. But in a case where you weren't aware of their situation, you would not have to repeat. You would have to repeat it again. Okay, so let's say you find yourself in the mikvah. Okay, so you're going to the mikvah, and you're washing your body. This is in the second halacha here, and you go to wash yourself, and you're in clear water, and you want something to drink. Okay, you're gonna take a drink of you left your Coke sitting on the side over there. You want to drink your Coke, so you need to cover your heart with a piece of garment. You also put a yarmulke on your head too, and you need to make sure that you can go ahead and say the blessing. Okay, you can use a garment, but you can't use your hand. Okay, and so too, this doesn't work if you try to use your hand to cover your head as well. That's not considered covering your head. And if the water is dirty, where you can't see different parts of your body, then you could recite the blessing because that's okay, but you have to get high enough out of the water so that way your lower body's in the water, your upper body's out of the water. Okay, and you also have to make sure that the water doesn't smell bad either, because then that would also not be permitted. And the Ramah also adds, now if you did the same thing with clear water, that would also work. Meaning keeping your upper body out of the water. Okay, so when you're in the water, the Mishnah Berurah adds, using the crossed arms is not good enough. We'll get to that in a second. It's a good question. Okay. So when the water is clear, it's not considered a cover when your whole body is inside of it. It's almost like having your entire body inside the same sheet. Okay. So the reason why is because you're considered all in the same spot, and you still have the problem of liba roa es erva. Your heart still sees your lower body. Now, if you put a garment on top of it, that would be fine because now you basically are blocking it from sight, and you're covered by the water. So that would be how they would do it with the sheet as well. Like I said before with the sheet, you press the sheet against your body. Okay, so, and just like we said before, you say the blessing with that on, and you have to have something on top of your head, but your hands don't work. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're covering your heart, covering your head, covering here, covering there. Hands don't work. You have to have garments on top of those things. Okay, so the idea is you can't say any of the Varm Shepard Kedusha in those cases. And if they're kind of clear and you're in a place where kicking up some dirt would help as well, that would be fine. Okay, but you can't use something that would make it dirty. Okay, halacha 3. If the person hugs themselves with their arms, that's considered a break. So thank you for waiting. Okay, so what happens, you're standing in the same water, and you hug your arms across your chest, okay? And goes below, you hug your arms below the ribs, even though you aren't really covered the same way, that's considered enough of a break, and that would be permitted. And the reason why this is considered acceptable is because this is an abnormal way of doing things. People don't usually hug themselves. So therefore the rabbis were lenient in these cases. Okay? Let's see. And this rule would apply as well, that if you're walking again with the nightgown or a long garment and you don't have any trunks on, if you go ahead and hug yourself, that would work as well. Okay, so there's some people who say that this rule, women can hug yourself higher. Yeah, well, I mean, yes. I mean, it has to be below the heart, but around the ribs, basically, is the idea. You have to below your heart. Your heart kind of sits in the sort of left side within the ribs. So I'm just giving an example where to hug yourself. Okay, there are some opinions who say that these rules don't apply to women. Okay, and they can say a blessing even when they are just wearing a long gown, even though there's no separation. And the Ramah says that if they don't have any clothes on, then they would have to sit on the floor, and that would be okay for them to then suffice for this rule of ein liba roes erva. Okay, and this rule wouldn't work for men. So the reason why for this lenient opinion is because there isn't really any way for the heart to kind of see the same thing, and it's a singular opinion. So it's considered a singular opinion, and you could rely on it in a time of great need, such as if you ran out of clothes. But preferably, you should follow the rules that we've mentioned already, and it's important to do that. Also, because there are some people like the Bach who disagree with it altogether, and say that that even wearing this is a problem. But since other people disagree with the Bach, you can rely on this in a case of great need. And so, therefore, when a woman is engaged in immersion and needs to make the blessing on immersion, even if she hasn't left the water completely, that's considered sufficient to say the blessing there. However, the proper conduct, as we're saying over here, is that since this is not the final opinion, it's preferable to have her heart above the water and to hug herself with her arms, and to follow the same rules as a man. Okay. And the Chacham Sodom brings this down as the proper halacha to follow as well. Or she could go ahead and make the mikveh a little bit more murky by kicking up some dirt from the bottom, but most of our mikvahs aren't designed that way anymore. Okay, let's see. Let's get finished over here. Okay, let's see. Now, let's see. The rest of your body, let's say the rest of your body can see, like your legs and the parts of you, can see the parts that should normally be covered. That's okay. So like your legs and stuff like that, that would be fine. Okay, but you should not make contact with yourself anywhere below the belt with either your arms, Okay, or your arm shouldn't be touching someone else, such as if you were sleeping and you're lying in bed and touching somebody's, any other parts. So it's forbidden to recite the Shema or any other prayers as long as you're in that position. And also, he's saying that you need to make sure that with your lower body that you don't just wear a straight skirt, but you have to actually wear pants, that because otherwise it would not be permitted, and in such a way that that you have a separation between your legs and the rest of your body. Okay, so what we're saying is that the sight is not a problem, but contact is a problem. Okay, let's finish up over here with 74. So let's say you have a long garment on, again, long cloth, and you are wearing a belt with it, and you have the belt from your waist and lower. Okay, even if though he doesn't have a shirt on, it's permitted to recite the Shema, but he cannot recite the Amidah, because you have to have something covering your heart for the Amidah. So like we said before, that's a little more stringent. So even though the Shema you could say, you would need to cover your entire body. For that, you would need a shirt for Shemona Esrei. Okay, and so therefore we're learning from the halacha, says the Mishna Berurah, is that it's not appropriate to dress this way or to conduct yourself in this way when you have to recite any blessing, and so much more so with Shema, and especially for tefillah. Okay, you also need to make sure to have your head covered as well. Okay, and we will hold it here. We will pick up next time, referring to more instances where it is appropriate and inappropriate to recite the Shema. Everyone have a wonderful day.